1987, one of the most iconic movie monsters was born. A movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and directed by John McTiernan, who would later go on to direct Die Hard, The Hunt for Red October, and The 13th Warrior, hit the silver screens. The critical response was largely positive and the film made nearly $100 million in box office sales worldwide. It was a hit, and thus a sequel was all but inevitable. But when Predator 2 hit theaters in 1990, the response was tepid at best and sub-zero at worst. It made half the cash worldwide that its predecessor had managed while receiving a largely negative response from film critics. Throughout my life, I've discussed with friends, peers, and acquaintances, both in real life and over the internet, about the quality of Predator 2 as a film. It seems the most common consensus, statistically and anecdotally speaking, is that Predator 2 is a bad film and a horrible sequel to such a cinematic success. So how come I enjoy Predator 2 so much? Is it a guilty pleasure? Am I simply amused easily? Or is it a legitimately entertaining film? In this video, I will analyze and compare the similarities and differences between Predator and Predator 2 in great detail. There will be spoilers, and if you haven't seen either film, then I recommend you do so before watching this video. Perhaps what made the original Predator so notable was how subversive it was with the typical action film tropes of the time. Casting Arnold Schwarzenegger as the starring role was not unintentional, seeing as he was becoming the icon of the action blockbuster. Predator drew from previous action films such as Commando and even Rambo, starring big, hulked-up military men leaping into the wilderness to fight the latest heavily armed terror. With the exception of the helicopter crash, the first 30 or so minutes of the film play out as you'd expect your bog-standard 80s action movie to play. Introduce super-masculine characters, introduce the conflict between honest fighting men and scheming, bureaucratic pencil pushers, and have lots and lots of explosions featuring a series of horribly written one-liners.
Yeah. Stick around. Knock, knock.
This is all very intentional, of course, designed to draw the audience into a comfortable and familiar set of tropes. The UFO scene at the start of the film? Completely forgotten amidst the charred chaos of guerrilla warfighters. That is, until a big, monstrous hand shows up. That's where all the tropes and ideals of the typical action movie are torn asunder. None of the characters are given any more impressive action sequences, save for Dutch. Each soldier is wiped out easily and within seconds, and soon enough it doesn't matter that CIA filth Dillon lied to the team in order to accomplish a mission. All that matters is survival. In the 80s, action films are all about masculine ideals, yet in the face of superior firepower, all that machismo meant, well, dick. So what about Predator 2? Well, it's also a subversion, just of a different type of action film. While the shift from a jungle setting to an urban one was, and still is, viewed as a negative change, it was done so that the film could tackle the urban cop action film instead. This time it drew on films such as Lethal Weapon, which is why Danny Glover was cast as lead character Mike Harrigan. Instead of the honorable soldier versus the bureaucratic desk jockey, it was the rules-bending hothead cop that got results against the suit-wearing command-giving authority. Just as true to the tropes, the death of a lifelong friend and partner is what makes things personal, and pushes the protagonist on a path of revenge, while that same authority does its best to take him off the case. The only difference here is that the protagonist isn't chasing after some law-breaking criminal, but the predator. The change in setting, moving from a jungle to the city, allows Predator 2 to capture the same spirit as the first film, that of applying a new spin to cliched action tropes, while changing the film's style. It allows each film to exist separately, providing a different atmosphere despite similar goals. It is still Predator in spirit without being a complete retread of the first film. So what others find to be a problem with the film, I actually find to be its strength.
This stuff will make you a goddamn sexual tyrannosaurus. Just like me.
You try that cowboy shit with me, fucking you can kiss this. Goodbye.
Long tall Sally. She's built sweet. She got everything that Uncle John needs.
So I go in for my physical, right? And the doctor says, I need a semen, stool, and urine sample. I say, gee, doc, I'm in a big hurry. Can I just leave my underwear?
Son of a bitch is dug in like an Alabama tick.
You're hit. You're bleeding, man.
I ain't got time to bleed.
Hey, Harrigan! More victims, more mutilation! Fuck you!
Another criticism often leveled at Predator 2 are its characters. They tend to be viewed as poorly written, poorly acted, or purely unoriginal. The funny thing is, you could say the same about many of the characters in the original Predator as well. Arnold's portrayal of Dutch in particular, whose sudden epiphanies often come off as half-baked and purely amateur.
He's using the trees.
Yet I'd say it is more easily overlooked in the original Predator because the characters are, for the most part, more subdued. That is, in terms of dialogue at least. With the exception of Jesse Ventura, Dutch, and Dylan, the characters are rather quiet, speaking only when necessary for the atmosphere of the film. Predator is going more for presence. You're supposed to feel the awe and intimidation of these characters more than you're supposed to get a sense of personality. The people you meet on the helicopter at the film's start are the characters that die and you end with. This isn't to say that the characters are bad or that they're cardboard cutouts. They are all charming or notable in some fashion. Blaine is the sort of man that drives a pickup and eats raw steaks for breakfast. Mac is a very intimidating, cold, and suspicious individual, at least to those he doesn't know. Billy is a quiet, reserved character that only speaks when absolutely necessary. Hawkins has a dirty sense of humor, and Pancho, speaks Spanish. Each character is given enough personality to serve the film, but seeing as they're all marked for death, there is very little done to develop them. Instead, they simply evoke a sort of presence, an aura if you will, that suggests Billy is comfortable out in the wild, that Mac is a very intimidating soldier, and that Dylan is getting soft. That is all we need to see all these ideals of masculinity getting torn down. But Predator 2 is a very different setting with very different source material to draw from. The characters in urban cop dramas are often more cartoonish or portrayed as larger than life. The rule-bending cop is supposed to be a hothead. There's always supposed to be a smartass or a tough-as-nails ball-busting woman on the force. These are part of the genre. In addition, we're not talking about soldiers here. We're talking about cops. These are the soggier men and women that try to fight the good fight on our streets at home. They're not the masculine ideal, but more representative of your average Joe Schmo going home to a wife and kids and all the stress that produces. Or at least if they're lucky enough to have a wife and kid at all. Otherwise, they're drinking alone at home or the bar. So instead of getting by with as little dialogue as possible, Predator 2 must convey these characters more colorfully, which means a very different style of writing. There's also a lot more going on than a single group out in the wilderness with nothing to discuss but, well, their survival. They have to work through the gang warfare, the identity of the third party, and the interference of the FBI. In addition to the genre, the setting also dictates the characters acting and behaving differently. Is the writing in Predator 2 bad? Is it worse? Is the acting terrible? Personally, I've never been bothered too much by it, but I also find that stuff to be secondary to the reason I'm watching these films to begin with. I mean, come on, it's not like the humans are what we came here to see. There you go. Now that's the reason you watch the movie. You aren't watching it for the people, you're watching it for the people getting slaughtered by the Predator, which is perhaps one of the reasons I find Predator 2 so much more entertaining. In the first Predator, the creature is much more of a menace. We know it is hunting man, and we learn by the end that it will only hunt those who are armed. So it has a small bit of an honor code, but otherwise is some vicious being with only a couple of weapons and a vague sense of motivation. It makes short work of each victim, and the only real fight you get to witness is the climactic battle. Now, there's a lot that's great about this confrontation. Dutch is forced to go back to mankind's primal roots. In order to defeat the much more technologically advanced foe. Yet, as clever as he is, Dutch is always at a disadvantage. The only reason he doesn't die is because the Predator decided to give him a fair chance. After all, Dutch did a pretty good job surviving this long, may as well see how he does in a hand-to-hand fight, right? It is even through sheer luck that the Predator, who avoids Dutch's last-ditch effort of a trap, happens to be in just the right spot to get crushed by the trap's weight mechanism. It's still a fun and entertaining action film, but with Predator 2, we get so much more. Now, if this simply relied on the typical ideas of more, we'd have a problem. More tools and weapons? Awesome. More kills? Fun. But we also get to establish much more of an honor code. The Predator won't kill Leona because she's pregnant, for example. Also, and this isn't an absolute certain reading of this, but I get the impression that the Predator was actually helping Danny until Danny withdrew his pistol. Otherwise, why bother catching him? Why not just let him fall? However, this is simply one interpretation of the action. After all, the Predator had plenty of chance to see that, yes, Danny was a weapon-wielding warrior. But what really makes Predator 2 such an entertaining film for me is the fight between Harrigan and the creature. While the Predator was at a constant advantage against Dutch, it is frequently forced to adjust its own tactics here. First its cloak gets busted, then it lost its plasma cannon, then it even lost its friggin' forearm before revealing more of its tools. It has to be just as resourceful and quick thinking as Harrigan, making it a much more suspenseful conflict. Yes, the special effects at the end are pretty terrible, and yes, it makes no sense how an alien ship managed to hide itself beneath Los Angeles without anyone noticing. But by developing the personality of the creature just a bit more, and forcing it into less advantageous situations in combat, Predator 2 is the film that really made the Predator itself interesting.
Take it.
Okay, it's gushing time. There are just so many more elements of the film that I like or find interesting. For example, everyone is always sweating in this movie. It really illustrates that it is not only a particularly hot summer, but that is partially why the Predator was drawn here in the first place. It is hinted at in the first film that they're drawn to particularly hot environments, and seeing the sweat on everyone's shirts and even the armpits of Jerry's suit help illustrate just how hot it is. While we may also scoff at how they portrayed Los Angeles of 1997, it was a reasonably cynical prediction in the vein of RoboCop's idea of Detroit. In the mid to late 1980s, Los Angeles was one of the top cities experiencing the crack cocaine epidemic, with pop culture icons referring to South Central as a no-go zone, a place where police have lost control.
Who the hell's in charge down here? The cops? They're outmanned, outgunned, and incompetent.
Just 2 years after this film released, the 1992 Los Angeles riots occurred, so this pessimistic vision of a war-torn Los Angeles may have seemed quite plausible. I also like how most of the main protagonists are minorities, with Jerry being the only white primary character. You have an African-American protagonist and 2 Latino partners fighting crime together. This is still an uncommon occurrence in today's action media, particularly in genre films, yet here it is handled in a natural manner. Race and gender don't matter between these characters. While each of them contains some trace of that identity, they aren't shoehorned into stereotypical roles. I love how Harrigan's fear of heights plays out in his confrontation against the Predator later on.
That's all I need is birds. Maybe I get lucky and fall.
I love that not all of King Willie's men really believe in voodoo.
But you know what? I tell you what I believe.
Shit happens.
Oh my god, it's a young Adam Baldwin! Look at the baby face! Okay, yeah, I think I've made it clear that I just love this movie. If you want me to argue which film is better artistically, I don't think I could give you an honest answer. There are some aspects to the original Predator that are simply done better, or at least in a less cheesy manner, yet there are so many elements that make Predator 2 a more entertaining film, whether or not it is objectively better, that I think Predator 2 is honestly the most perfect sort of sequel you could ask for. It takes the basic idea of its predecessor, in this case to insert the Predator into a generic action film and subvert the expectations, without repeating the first film beat for beat. The universe has been developed now. We know the government wants the Predator. We know that the Predator has a lot more fun toys and greater specifics to its honor code. We also know they've been hunting here for at least a couple centuries and can thus insert them into any time period we want. So I must confess, I was disappointed that Predator simply decided to take us back to a jungle. While I enjoy all 3 movies and think they're worth watching, I cannot help but favor the second one, cheese and all.